Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for some guided meditation as well as words of Dhamma from Tan Nisabho, who's visiting us here at Empty Cloud for a few weeks. And we're very grateful to have him and his wonderful reflections on the Dhamma. So good evening so far to Denise, Adine, Ron, Elaine, Jens, and Aya Vimalanyani, who is watching from Sri Lanka, I believe. So good to see all of you, and good evening as well to those of you watching, but not saying hello, but you can say hello. So feel free to type into the live chat a brief hi, and maybe even where you're from. And at any time, feel free to type in any questions or comments you have as well, whether based on the guided meditation or on Tan Nisabho's Dhamma talk. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Tan Nisabho for the guided meditation.
Next, Bhante Sumano. So, yes, I'm visiting from the West Coast and really enjoying being here. It's been lovely. So I just want to thank Empty Cloud, Bhante, Sudaso, Ayasom, and the whole community, as always. But I think we'll begin with a meditation, and then in about a half an hour, we can get into a bit of a talk. So begin by placing the body erect. Drawing the lumbar, the lower back in slightly. And moving the awareness one vertebrae at a time up, as if stringing pearls one on top of another. Until one reaches the crown of the head and can imagine a string suspending one's head and spine. Drop the chin slightly, widen the chest, soften the neck, relax the jaw, relax the eyes. Sit with dignity. And now take 3 breaths, deep ones. So fill the lungs as deeply as one can. Hold for a time. And then release very, very slowly. And this is a very powerful way to calm the body very quickly. Now, breathe in a way that feels comfortable. You can adjust it a little bit if you need to. Start with your awareness at the belly. Move it to the left and the right of the center line, the center meridian. And just feel the sensations of breathing at each of those points. And you'll notice probably that one side of the body is more numb than the other. And over a long period of time of meditation practice, one can work to balance this out, but for now, just notice. Now, most of the time our awareness is stuck in our heads as Westerners or as modern people. So imagine a bowl of warm butter melting over the top of the head and down the back of the neck. This warm, bright substance drawing awareness down to the shoulder blades as you breathe slowly. Now imagine that the breath is a white mist. And establish awareness first in a chamber reaching roughly from the bottom of the neck to the head, top of the head. Just imagine the white mist moving in and out of that, the breath. Or one could imagine a white ball glowing at the center of that chamber, expanding and contracting with the breathing, nourishing all the parts of the body that have been starved for that breath. Pervading with brightness. Then allow that awareness to drop to the heart and torso area. That's the second chamber. And have the same image, this bright white mist moving in and out through all parts of the body. And if one wants, one can focus especially on having that white mist move through the shoulder blades, as we also neglect our back. Our awareness tends to be focused up front, so the back is usually starved. And allow the awareness to drop once more to the third and final chamber, roughly from the diaphragm down to the tailbone. And imagine the white mist moving in and out, or a white ball moving there. And one can especially imagine breathing that white mist through the kidneys, or sometimes up, drawing energy up through the tailbone. And after one has rested there for a time, expand the awareness to encompass the whole body, roughly from the tailbone to the top of the head. And just breathe there with the whole body in one chamber, allowing the mind to center itself on one point, but still aware of the entire body, like a spider resting at the center of a web. And frequently that point will be the nose or the chest. And at the beginning, this chamber will encompass that whole body, but as the mind refines, you'll find that chamber rises, so that instead of stretching from the tailbone to the head, it will begin to, the mind won't want to go lower than, say, the diaphragm or the heart, and will stretch above the head slightly. It rises as it refines. And repeat. Move through each three chambers, allowing the mind to drop when it loses interest or drops naturally, nourishing all these parts of the body that have been so starved for breath energy, playing with the visualizations, trying to establish a sense of refreshment. And after all three chambers, coming to relax into the whole body, just relax. And if one begins to center at that one point, such as the tip of the nose, allow that to happen, tracking it like a silk thread, the breath, but still aware of the whole field. Allow the sounds in as well if one wants. Just relax. And if tightness comes into the eyes or the head or the jaw, just notice and soften. So that awareness once again drops to the torso and the heart. And if one has a lot of excess energy that's restless, one can try to place the awareness near the tailbone, near the earth, and let the energy ground. And if the mind has a lot of excess energy of a different kind, one has to experiment to see which kind it is. One can place one's awareness right above the head or at the center of the brain, the pineal gland. And the mind will clench briefly and then drop. But if one has headaches frequently or begins to tighten up too much there, be gentle and don't remain there for too long if it seems like it's tightening. The torso is generally safer, but sometimes it can be useful too. When things have refined a bit, allow the mind to rest in those upper chambers and brighten naturally. One can draw the energy down the arms and not the hands. One can establish awareness at the outside of the hip bones. For some reason, that tends to be a very restful spot. And then when things have calmed down and the mind is settled, a bit like a dog that's been circling its bed and decided to finally lie down, and just allow that full-bodied awareness to remain, but stay with that one point as well, tracking the breath like a silk thread, and paying special attention to the points between the inhale and the exhale. And one will begin to notice more and more the subtle sensation, so that eventually there's no sensation of a break in the breath at all. Just one continuous motion of energy, and the breath will refine and become much more subtle. As one feels the whole body in awareness, one may become sensitive also to a subtle energy coursing up the spine, over the crown of the head and down, along the central meridian, down the chest, to the tailbone, and then up the spine again. And one can let the mind move that way with that energy, inhaling and letting it run up the spine, exhaling and let it move down the chest. Or one can move the opposite way in what's called the water cycle, up the chest, down the spine. Just play around and see what feels right. Really notice if one can keep the awareness of the breath at the nose or wherever the other point is one is centered, really continuous, unbroken, a thin silken thread. And notice also if a subtle brightening of awareness begins to occur. You can almost miss it at first. Doesn't necessarily manifest as a bright ball of light or something, just a gradual brightening of the whole visual field and of awareness with light. This is called the light of the breath, a nimitta or sign. Or if one has cultivated the sound of silence, it may also become prominent. And hold both that light or that sound or the field of the body as a whole in mind with the breathing at the nose or at that other point. The breathing should always be there. But then you get one other object, if you want it, to help keep the awareness bright, expansive, and lucid. If the mind starts to wander, things get a little bit too nebulous, and come back to the first step of just tracking the breath, seeing if it's long or short. Clarify. And once one has made things a bit more crystalline again and anchored, then one can bring back the broader awareness. And if you can't find the breath, try to be more delicate. Really look right there where the breath is ending on the exhalation. Narrow in right at that point, at the tip of the nose. Not to the exclusion of all else, but sometimes the thread of the breath there is getting more subtle and more refined, and one just has to keep one's finger very carefully on it. And finish by drawing this bright awareness into a bubble of light. Bring it to a wide bubble near the heart area. Just gently there, and then this is the somatic back door to unlocking metta. Doesn't necessarily rely on words or images right away. Just allow the brightness to be right there near the heart. Not the actual heart, but in the center of the chest and slightly lower than the real heart. Be delicate in that area. Allow it just to warm and kindle a sense of loving kindness right there. For yourself first. Just acknowledge what you've gone through. The difficulty that tends to accompany every day. And the fact that we so rarely get to stop and just take stock of the heart's bruising and our own exhaustion. So just let yourself be exhausted for a moment and spread that compassion and that brightness to yourself and hold yourself in that space without judgment. Let the heart crack open and be weak for just a second. Let it let down its guard. This is the directive of the First Noble Truth, to comprehend our suffering. So take a second to do that. And then think of someone who cares for you. And imagine them looking at you or gazing at you with love, really wishing you well. Someone who really does wish you the best, who you know cares in that way. And just imagine how they would look at you with the kindest eyes they could have. Or imagine what they've done, some spontaneous act of goodness and kindness they've done, some gift they've given you. Just imagine that warmth coming to you. It can be hard to cultivate metta for ourselves, but if you use the gaze of another who loves you to inhabit and catalyze it, then maybe that's the back door towards realizing that you're worthy of that. So just feel what they feel to you. How would they look at you? Or bring to mind someone you care for deeply, who you're close to. Maybe several people. Or maybe a cat, a dog, the birds outside. Anything, really. And shrink them. And then bring them into your heart, into that space of bright light. Instead of spreading the metta out, which dissipates it, bring people into it. It's a funny visualization, but it works. And just breathe with them for a while in there. Wishing that they can be free from suffering, happy, loved, cared for. And realize that what you're doing by meditating, by coming to Dhamma, by spending time on this is the greatest gift you could possibly give to them, by far. Though they may not know it, though the world might criticize it or not understand it, though they might look annoyed when you leave dinner a little early or don't come to the party, you're shaping your heart into something that can truly love. And there's no greater gift. And it will sink into them little by little, whether or not they know it. You're showing them what it means to live a life aligned and dedicated to Dhamma, to the highest purpose, which is liberation. And in doing that, you give them a Polaris, a North Star to follow for themselves too.
Well, thank you, Nisabho, for guiding us in that meditation. And hello to some other friends joining in. So hello, Chandrasekhar, Ellen from Montreal, Linda, Melinda as well, and Lucas, Gali, and Danilo. So good to see everyone online. And at this time, Nisabho will be sharing some words of Dhamma with us. And during the talk, feel free to type in any questions you may have about anything that comes up, and we'll get to them afterwards. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Nisabho.
Thanks, Bhante. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So I hope people enjoyed that meditation. It was a lot packed in there, but I figure better to give the toolkit in full if I can, or as much of it as I can, and then you'll have a chance to use it at your leisure in the future, even if it was a lot for a half an hour. And it's a helpful, I wanted to move through breath meditation envisioned as a broad exploration of the body and the body's energies, and breath as conceptualized in Buddhist thought, not just as a simple or coarse wind at the nose or in the lungs, but rather as the subtle energy that courses through the body, in Sanskrit pranya, in Pali Pana, in Taoist thought chi. And the topic of today's talk is the breath through similes, wind, water, bloom, specifically pointing to the different images the Buddha used when speaking of breath meditation. And for those who tuned into Saturday's talks on breath meditation, engaged anapanasati, which means breath meditation, then you'll know that we spoke briefly to these different images that the Buddha uses to talk about deep states of concentration, the jhanas. And although these don't line up perfectly with the sutta we were speaking to on Saturday, the Anapanasati Sutta, Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, which is composed of 16 steps, they do have rough parallels. And it can be very useful to look into what those images encode in terms of the approach to breath meditation, because there's a lot hidden there. People can encounter the Buddhist lists and come out of it with the idea that the Buddha was sort of a dry and mechanical teacher, without realizing that the Buddha used a great deal of poetic language and really beautiful imagery. In fact, the Triggata and the Therigatha, the verses of the elder monks and nuns, is the first collections of nature poetry in humanity's history, because you had all these men and women classically trained in formal poetic verse suddenly going off into the forest as monastics and writing about it, or speaking rather, not writing at the time. So in Buddhism, in early Buddhism, you do have this great and rich collection of poetry, of using language as not just descriptor, but as catalyst, and of encoding knowledge into image. So perhaps some of the most potent images the Buddha brings to the practice are those of the four jhanas, and these can be found many places in the suttas. One place is Majjhima Nikaya 39, the Mahaasapura Sutta, which runs through the entire training, but they're everywhere. And in it, the Buddha describes the four jhanas. So he pairs a sort of analytical description of each with its corresponding image. So the first jhana, he speaks of as quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. One enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure, born of seclusion, accompanied by applied and sustained thought. Just as a bathman's or a bathman's apprentice would knead water into a ball of bath powder so that no part of that ball of bath powder was unpervaded by the cool moisture, just so one spreads and pervades one's body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, so that no part of one's body is unpervaded by that cool rapture and pleasure. So the interesting points here are that rapture and pleasure are, in Pali, piti and sukha. And piti is etymologically related to the word to drink. And throughout these images, one will see this image of water coming up again and again. And that's why, for me personally, there's many ways of translating this, and they all have, well, many of them have merit. But the translation of piti instead of rapture, which is very common as a translation, is refreshment. Piti, for me, has this connotation of refreshment. And as we were working with the breath during this guided meditation, when we were speaking of the flow of nourishing these dry parts of the body with energy, or with this visualization, this is the sense of refreshment and moisturizing, basically, that is contained in the image of the bathman's apprentice. So in the Buddhist time, soap wasn't a thing. So what they had was this powder similar to flour, and you'd knead in water until it became similar to bread flour, to dough. So in this image of cultivating the first jhana, the Buddha's saying that this bathman or bathman's apprentice very consciously and actively kneads and massages in this moisture to the ball of bath powder or the body. And in the description of the jhana that precedes the image, the Buddha speaks of rapture and pleasure born of seclusion applied by directed and sustained thought. And directed and sustained thought in Pali are known as vitaka vichara, which directed thought and evaluation, it's sometimes translated as. And it's the application of it's talking to oneself, either in actual sentences or in image, and or sort of subtle notes of those two. So directed thought is the application of an instruction or an image, and then vichara, evaluation, is tasting what that catalyzes in the body and mind, seeing how is that. So one might say, I find that applying vitaka or directed thought with a question is much more gentle, especially for us modern, overly aggressive people, than phrasing directed thought as an order. So instead of saying, be with the breath at the whole body, one can ask instead, what way of breathing feels most comfortable? How do I feel the breath right now? Can I remain with just the breath? And if one applies thought in this way, then the mind, heart, the citta, and the body respond very naturally and gently. And then as they do, as one sees how the breath softens, how it does feel good in a certain way, tastes it, that's vichara, that's evaluation. And that can either take the form of an actual evaluating verbally, like, how is that? Or it can be much more subtle, just the tasting of that. Frequently, vitaka vichara are compared to ringing a bell and listening to its resonance echo. So when we were applying all these images, the breath is a white mist oscillating in and out of chambers. The breath is mist coming in through the shoulder blades, the kidneys, or even just moving the awareness around the body. These are all forms of vitaka, of applied thought. We're applying a perception, an image, and then seeing how that feels. Maybe one really does get a sense of refreshment in one spot, or maybe the mind doesn't actually want to be, in a certain chamber, say the upper chamber, and it wants to drop. That sort of evaluating of the effect of the applied perception, that's evaluation, vichara. And we use these actively, these tools of visualization, to knead and massage in this pleasure, this breath energy into the body, as the bathman's or the bathman's apprentice does to the bath powder until all the body is nourished, until it feels full. And frequently, piti, refreshment, is compared to that sensation when one just bends down to drink after being very thirsty. Whereas sukha, pleasure, that comes afterwards, that's a more still, satisfied sense of well-being of the person who's just drunk deeply. And piti, this refreshment, tends to be very dynamic. It's a sankhara, a formation. It's bound with intention, so it moves. So it can be this sense of this breath energy running up the spine and down the front, these meridians, or of the body slowly soaking up this breath energy like a sponge. Whereas once it's soaked up enough, then sukha, pleasure, is the next sensation, and that's a feeling, vedana, which means it is still. It doesn't necessarily have to move in that way. So that's when the ball of bath powder has been completely pervaded with this cool water. And the fact that it can either be a bathman or a bathman's apprentice means that the Buddha had so much hidden in this language, you don't realize it until it just continually more comes out. But it means that both a new practitioner and an expert will practice the exact same way. So the image of the second jhana, or the description of it, is that with the cessation of directed thought and evaluation, one enters and abides in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure born of concentration without applied and sustained thought. Just as a cool mountain lake with no inflows to the north, south, east, or west, but fed by a cool spring down below and filled with occasional showers from above, would become pervaded by that cool water. Even so, one spreads and pervades one's body with the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. So in this image, one notes that the active element of the bathman's apprentice's hands has left. Similarly, in the description, vitaka vichara, directed thought and evaluation, are absent. So things have become calm enough that this active application of perception, these visualizations, this moving of the mind, has stilled. And now, as I spoke of with the wide field of the body beginning to slowly give rise to the sense of refreshment of breath energy moving up the spine and down the front, or sometimes this robust sense of energy coming from the tailbone, or this bright light pouring in through the crown of the head. The piti and sukha, the rapture and pleasure, come naturally of their own accord. They just rise or arise without this active element. And I've always thought it was very interesting. This isn't, the Burmese edition, I believe, lacks the image of the showers feeding the lake. It just has the spring from below. But in Vedic thought, in Kundalini yoga, and in Taoist conception, the two main doorways into the body of energy are the base of the tailbone, or the perineum, which is the earth energy. It's very robust. And then the top, or the crown of the head, which is where heaven's energy enters. And it's bright light. So I find it very interesting that in this image of the lake, there's the spring from below and the showers from above. Almost as if perhaps the Buddha was speaking to these two ways of chi coming into the body or breath energy, but this is complete conjecture. I just thought it was an interesting parallel. And the third jhana, the Buddha speaks of with the fading as well of rapture. One enters and abides in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare one has a pleasant abiding and is mindful. And one experiences pleasure divested of rapture. Didn't get the wording completely right, but those are the essential elements. Just as in a pool of cool water, red, white, and blue lotuses born in the water would grow in the water, saturated by that cool water so that no part of them, from their roots to their tips, was unpervaded by that cool water. Even so, a practitioner pervades, or the pleasure divested of rapture pervades the body. So in this image, one notices that all motion is gone. It's no longer is there even the spring from below and the showers from above. It's just lotuses in water that's completely still. And in the description analytically, the rapture, the piti, the refreshment, has also faded, leaving just the sukha, the pleasure, which is still. And this, I believe, is when things have really, in breath meditation, calmed, and one's body feels deeply satiated. And the fourth jhana is described as with the fading away, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the previous disappearance of joy and grief. One enters and abides in the fourth jhana, purity of mindfulness and equanimity. Just as a man sitting covered head to toe with a white cloth so that no part of his body would be untouched by that white cloth. Even so, one pervades the body with a pure awareness. And I didn't get the wording completely right on that one either, but I've asked Longpo Pasno about this, one of my teachers at Abhayagiri, and he spoke of this sense where every one of the previous three images, there's a sense of this water, this refreshment saturating the body. In this, there suddenly is a separation between the mind and the body, as framed in the separation between the sheet and the body. The mind being this bright sheet over the body, but separate from it. And I've always thought this had a beautiful correspondence or resonance with the third tetrad of the Anapanasati Sutta, steps 9 through 12 of the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, which correspond in some modes of thought to the third foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of mind. Namely, that suddenly, when one has cultivated this deep satisfaction in the body, then the mind forms to a bright field and rises and no longer feels bound to the body. Something new has occurred, and there's a separation suddenly. And obviously, these images don't correspond perfectly to that sutta. And also, one doesn't have to have attained each of these jhanas to utilize these images. I found them to be extremely helpful and useful in just moving through those steps of the Anapanasati Sutta, whether or not my concentration at the time was deep or not. Because there is, they point to the ways of working with the breath. They point to a sense of refreshment which should be there, to the active element of working with the breath, to how the mind steadily becomes nourished, refreshed, and satisfied. And they're helpful guideposts. Mindfulness of breathing has so often been taught in the West as just bringing the mind to one point, which for perhaps 90% of the practitioners I know just results in the feeling of banging your head against a brick wall after about a week and dry. It's no fun for many. Whereas these images really point to this whole-bodied awareness and to a practice which is deeply pleasant and beautiful. And Ajahn Brahm would frequently say that first one becomes aware of the breath, then aware of the beautiful breath, and then the breath fades and one is only aware of the beautiful. So the Buddha was not dismissive of the power of of beauty. These images are meant to catalyze experience. And as poetic as they are, as you can see, there's no word out of place in them. They're unbelievably detailed. And every time I stumble across imagery like this, my respect for the suttas grows even more. The amount encoded in these suttas is astounding. And as one practices year after year, one gains little glimpses into how the genius of that teacher and how much he put in there. Perhaps my favorite image of all is one of the few images the Buddha gave of Nibbana, which is where all this work with the breath and concentration is aimed. And he said in several suttas, one of which is the Atiyaraga Sutta, 12.64, in the Samyutta Nikaya, if light entered a window, where would it land? Entered the window of a house, where would it land? And the bhikkhus say it would land on the west wall. And he says, okay, what if there were no west wall? And they say it would land on the ground. He said, what if there was no ground? And they say, I think water. Yeah, they had the conception of the ground on the water. Yeah, so it would land on the water. And if there's no water, where would it land? It would not land. And he said, this is also what the analogy of the mind, which doesn't proliferate and does not land on anything, awakening. And this image of light I find to be unbelievably insightful, because light, just as Nibbana, is something completely outside of our conception, to the point where the Buddha spoke of it only in brief moments by tipping his hat to it, saying it's worth going, we're getting there. Just so light exists outside of the realm of what we can really conceptualize. So this is true in several respects. One is that if one has read the suttas, you'll frequently come to the phrase, or what's called the tetralemma, which is this question that many people pose. Does a Tathagata, an enlightened being, exist after death? Do they not exist? Do they both exist and not exist? Do they neither exist nor not exist? So that's confusing. And the Buddha does not answer, because this state is completely outside of conception. And similarly, when scientists at the beginning of the 1900s tried to figure out the nature of light, whether it was a particle or a wave, they were completely unable to. It functions as both. Various experiments don't allow it to be classified as one or the other, or neither or both. So it's a brilliant example of the tetralemma in that way. Similarly, according to general relativity, all objects are moving through space-time at the speed of light, which means when one moves through space more and more quickly, one moves through time more and more slowly, diverting a bit of one's motion through time into motion through space, which means that the one thing that is completely timeless, which experiences no time, is light. And third is that whereas every object in the universe relies on frame of reference for its speed. So for example, if I move towards another person and we're each walking at 5 miles an hour towards each other, I will see that person approaching me at 10 miles an hour because it's my speed and theirs. But light speed does not change regardless of the frame of reference. It's always the same. It's a universal constant. So I don't necessarily know if the Buddha knew all of these things in exactly the way we're articulating them, but I find his comparison of the awakening to light as unbelievably beautiful and apt in more ways than perhaps I initially realized. And also a helpful encouragement of where this practice goes. The world of practitioners the Buddha came into is filled with the worship of fire. And perhaps one of the most simple, and granted overly simple, ways of describing what the Buddha did was replace the energy of fire with the energy of light. A cool radiance. And that serves as a powerful guide, I think, an intuitive guide, as many of these images do, to those of us walking the path. So, that's enough.
Annamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Dadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Much gratitude to Tan Nisabho for those words of Dhamma. And it seems like there's already a couple comments and questions, but if there's anything else, feel free to type it in and we'll bring it up after the ones that are already here. So Danilo says, greetings, Venerable. I have had trouble recently with meditation. It's been hard to concentrate and I don't seem to be getting anywhere with the breath. That's it.
I can speak to it, but also feel free to type in a bit more detail if you want. It's a somewhat broad question. I find these techniques have helped me a great deal. I find that most people are taught in the West, just focusing on the breath at one point, which I think is largely responsible for the failure of samadhi practice in the West up until recently. I would make that generalization. I think these broad techniques are very helpful. Some resources you can look into are on dhammatalks.org. There's 2 very useful books, Keeping the Breath in Mind and With Each and Every Breath, either translated by or written by Ajahn Jeff Thanissaro Bhikkhu. So those are very helpful resources. And they provide some very concrete ways of working with this breath energy. However, also, I think for modern people, we are so alienated from our bodies, from our torsos. Like Ajahn Amaro says, we just conceptualize our bodies as things that keep our necks from dragging on the ground. And so sometimes it requires a bit of an expedient means to allow the breath and awareness to drop back into the torso before one can actually begin these processes. The visualizations we spoke of in this guided meditation, they're useful, but if one really is sort of stuck in one's head, like most of us tend to be, they're of limited use. So I think for us modern people, expedient means are really important. Useful techniques include Qigong. I would recommend a book called The Way of Energy. It was written in the 80s, but it's brilliant. A lot of monks I know use it. There's 5 standing poses in it specifically, which are very powerful. Longpo Suchito, Ajahn Suchito, a well-known teacher in our tradition, teaches Qigong at almost every retreat. And many monks I know use it. Qigong is very powerful. I've recommended this too many times, but it's helped me, so I'm just going to do it anyways. Cold showers. I really find it helps. It really brings the energy quickly down. Exercise. Yoga can help a bit, but if you're stuck in your head, if you're not able to access this sense of refreshment and sukha, looking into these techniques and trying to find a way to help drop the energy into the chest and reacquaint oneself with the body instead of just the head.
And Gita says, thank you, Venerable Nisabho, for sharing the Anapanasati Sutta. It's the 3rd tetrad. It's so blissful just listening to you. Absolute Dhammasukha. And good evening to Nancy, Anita, and Celestino. And Gita says, Venerable, is it said in the suttas that we lay followers can also reach the paths and fruits of this noble eightfold path?
Yes. You can. You should do it. There's many examples in the suttas of lay people attaining fruit. Many stream enterers, which is the first level of awakening, once returners, a few non-returners. The Buddha, however, says that if, I was reading the sutta just recently, I believe, but full awakening will lead to one renouncing the household life. So a full arahantship, after people became arahants, they went forth or were killed by, there's like a few instances of cows coming out of nowhere. It's just unfortunate, but it's okay because they were awakened. So, yes, it is possible. And I think it's important to, one of the really amazing benefits of the monastic form is the form. Longpo Pasno, Ajahn Pasno, Bhante Sudasa's preceptors and one of my teachers, the abbot of Abhayagiri, says frequently that the props are very important. And they are, because we're surrounded by props of one kind or another. Either it's the TV and this or that, the Netflix account, the phone, or whatever our clothing is, or the props are a Buddha image, a shrine, an outfit, a schedule. But we're surrounded by structures, one or the other. So very consciously tuning those structures to the path. And the Buddhist monastic form, this is the great benefit, is that the heart's palsied shaking is almost impossible to still alone by act of will. So one has to rely on these structures to help calm the hands and heart enough for it to walk straight and to keep one's gaze level. So we have many rules as monastics, which help us stay contained. And we have the outfits, we have all these things to remind us of what our real goal is. And lay people don't always realize that the Buddha gave them a pretty beautiful structure as well that's not utilized enough. So there's many cases in the suttas of dedicated lay practitioners who wear white at least one day a week, who keep a Sabbath day, an Uposatha day, where they just practice. There's a story of these two ministers of King Pasenadi, who always slept with their head towards the Buddha wherever he was. You don't have to do that, but you could somehow. Think about that one, maybe towards Bodh Gaya. But availing oneself of these structures, the 5 precepts on that Uposatha day, holding 8 precepts, turning off the phone, drawing near monasteries, creating a room in the house dedicated to a shrine. One can, if one's dedicated, one really can create a lay life which is conducive to practice. And like Bhante Sudasa said this morning, that might include giving up your Netflix account and tuning into monk flicks, which I think is a new thing we're doing, which is this, I suppose.
And the final question is Danilo, referring to cold showers and his aversion to it. Is it okay if I just use a tub to slowly pour cold water on myself?
How's that better? That sounds terrible. I mean, yeah, I guess you could. The point is the cold water. If it helps, you can initially go into warm water and then turn it cold, but it does take an act of will, it's true. You'll get used to it, though. The longer you can do it, the better, in my opinion, to a limit, a minute or two, something like that.
Are there any live questions?
I have a question. From experience and what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like the 4th jhana has resonance with step 9 or step 12, so experiencing the mind or liberating the mind, where I'm no longer, or one is no longer feeling the rapture and piti, but then it goes more into the awareness of the mind, which can hold the body, but it's more separate. So I'm curious on your thoughts about that. And then an additional addendum. Then there's deliberate thought in steps 13 through 16, which are possibilities once you've reached that 4th jhana.
So Gunnar's question, you may have been able to hear, but just to summarize and clarify, saying that the image of the 4th jhana, the white sheet that covers the body, seems to correspond to the steps 9 through 12 of the Anapanasati Sutta. That is becoming sensitive to the mind, gladdening the mind, concentration of the mind, liberating the mind, which also in some schools of thought correspond to the 3rd foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of mind. And the addendum was that steps 13 through 16 of the Anapanasati Sutta, breathing in and out, contemplating impermanence, contemplating dispassion, contemplating relinquishment, and contemplating, no, I missed it again.
Cessation.
Cessation, then relinquishment. Thank you, Bhante. seem to be directed thought and of a kind as well. And so with regards to the first question, yes, I also find that there's resonance there, Gunnar. I think I referenced that briefly. But yeah, and not to say that one who's come to those steps of the Anapanasati Sutta has reached fourth jhana, but yes, in that image and in the description, the body doesn't seem to be as there's not the same language around pleasure pervading the body, and there does seem to be a separation. In my own experience with coming to those steps in the sutta, not speaking about jhana necessarily, just those steps in that sutta, is in meditation, there is a sense of the mind kind of clarifying and becoming bright. And one can notice in the earlier steps in the second tetrad of that sutta, after rapture or refreshment and pleasure arise, frequently that's when a nimitta, what we call a sign, will arise of light. Ajahn Fuang, Ajahn Jeff's teacher, called it the light of the breath. And it's very common. So yeah, for me, that whole trajectory and that imagery and the idea of the light of the breath and this sort of sign coming up, for me, it also manifests as the sound of silence. Speak exactly to that of this sort of the white sheet somehow, touching the body, but not quite part of it in the same way as the previous three images. So yes, it has resonance, I find, even if the correspondence isn't exact. And the addendum of the last steps of the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta being elements of directed thought in their own right. Yes, I also think that's true. And I think that can either be looked at as when one's mind has calmed, then one can really turn it towards looking at different phenomena in the mind in one's life. One can turn it towards looking at the body, and the mind that is still is extremely powerful and can see truth. However, also I've heard it used or said that those 4 steps can be and are applied at each previous step of the sutta as directed ways of evaluating where one is. So one sees the impermanence of a certain meditation object. Say, in the first 2 steps of the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, one sees the impermanence of the breath as the inhalation and exhalation, and then one becomes dispassionate dispassioned towards that. One isn't as interested in it. It seems coarse. One sees how it ends very quickly, and then one relinquishes it and moves up to the next step, like letting go of a lower rung of a ladder and grabbing to the next higher rung of the ladder. And you see how, as that sutta progresses, the meditation objects one is using becomes more and more stable, less impermanent. So the coarse inhalation and exhalation are very impermanent. They're constantly moving. But once one gets to the steps of feeling, say, pleasure throughout the body, it's a much more static field. It's much more still. It's still impermanent, but less obviously so. So yeah, in that case, those would be contemplations one would apply at every juncture of the sutta.
Thank you, very helpful.
Yeah.
And there's a question from Denise that says, when PT is taking over the body, it feels as if there's actual physical movement, but that can't be, since the movement I feel is often circular in motion. Any thoughts?
I think you must be referencing the circuit of the breath energy, though I'm not sure. And I would say that in this conception of the bodily energy, the chi, the prana, the panna, that it doesn't have to be accompanied by actual motion at all. In fact, it's only when the body really becomes still that one becomes sensitized to this motion. But yes, it tends to move in circles. There's the very concrete orbit that I mentioned many times, up the spine, down the front, or up the front, down the spine. But the Taoists have numerous ways of conceptualizing it. Down the hands, up the arms, down the feet. So one can play with it a lot, but it always moves in circles. And yeah, one is working with the wind element. In the Buddhist thought, there's 4 elements, and this actually speaks to Gunnar's question as well. And one is working with the wind element, which is this movement, as it's conceptualized. But then in several lists, the Buddha adds the element of, he moves the traditional 4 elements to a list of 6, and he includes space and consciousness. And for me, that movement towards the white sheet, towards the conscious, towards mindfulness of mind, frequently has this feel of you're moving away from this chorus element of, say, the wind in the body, or this sort of refreshment and unification of the different parts, which might be more watery, to space and consciousness. And frequently that actually occurs for me by just raising the awareness when it's very bright and such to above the head, actually, instead of in the body. Sometimes the frame of the body feels too constricting after things have become really bright and energized. So allowing the awareness to expand outside of the frame, like the white sheet, moving from 4 elements to 6.
And Daniela says, I will try to take a cold shower tonight.
Yeah, Daniela. All right. In the morning too. It's important.
So thanks everyone for joining. If you have any lingering questions on breath meditation, then tomorrow, both in the morning and in the evening, Bante Strasso and Tan Nisabho will be sharing some more words of Dhamma on the practice of Anapanasati. And if you have any general questions, feel free to bring them to Monk Chat on Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. But for tonight, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your night.